So in today's ranking the ports, we are doing Double Dragon. So of course Double Dragon is probably one of the most famous beat 'em ups from the arcades from back in the day, 1987. This one was actually developed and published by Technos Japan, and it features two brothers, Billy and Jimmy, as they attempt to rescue their dojo student Marianne from the Black Warriors. Let me just remind you that there's particular versions of Double Dragon which you won't necessarily see in this video. So we got the Nintendo NES version, which was very different from the arcade version in many ways. We also got Double Dragon for the Atari Jaguar, again a very different version. The Game Gear version also won't be here because that's another game altogether. So we're going to rank the very worst to the very best. There is some hidden gems in here, as well as some extremely bad ports. So without further ado, let's get on with this. First up, we have the port that went down in history as one of the worst games ever. This is Melbourne House's version of Double Dragon. If you haven't played this game, then let this gameplay be a lesson to you. As you can see, sprites appear to be in two halves, as there is a background which displays halfway through their torsos as you move around. No music at all, a very annoying couple of sound effects which really irritates you after a couple of minutes. No ability to roundhouse kick or even flying kick. No larger size sprites for characters like Bobo. Getting past each stage truly feels like an eternity. What you see is what you get. This is one that I had as a kid. I truly didn't appreciate just how terrible it was until years later. The developers clearly just gave up on life with this port. Even when enemies die, they just disappear. There is no proper opening for the game with the garage doors, or no seeing Marianne being taken away from the Shadow Gang. Truly shocking. I still want my £1.99 back from 1990. The only true good thing about this version is spot on collision detection, as well as fairly good controls. Next up in this list, a couple of years later after the tragic of the Melbourne House port, Ocean Software released its own version of Double Dragon, which was only available on cartridge. This version is a slight step up from the Melbourne House original game, but not that much better either. The good thing, at least with Ocean's version, is that we actually had an option to have music or sound effects, and even a proper opening. The game opens up the garage opening just like the arcade original did too. This version appears to have torsos connected too, which is a win-win really. Flying kicks actually work too in this version. However, collision detection with other sprites is way off in this version. You can see in the gameplay that I wasn't getting too far with this for that reason. It's a real shame, because if Ocean just put a little bit more work into this version, this could have been a winner. Next up, we have the IBM PC or DOS port of Double Dragon. You might notice that the speed might not be accurate, but I did set the emulation to the slowest machine, and this is the slowest the game can actually be played at through emulation. Firstly, playing it as Jimmy in the gameplay, you might notice that sprite colors are seriously interfering with background colors, which can get a little overwhelming at times, especially when the game gets busy. This is just one bad thing. Secondly, the controls tend to have a mind of its own. Very hard to pull off flying kicks. At times I had enemies in headlocks, but when kicking heads in, it would not respond. No music, as you can hear. I wasn't actually expecting a Bobo to smash through the wall, but he actually did. As I progressed further into the back alley during Mission 1, I noticed that suddenly characters grew what looked like chicken pops, where some kind of colour clash was presenting itself. I'm not sure. Odd, because as Mission 1 began, Jimmy kind of looked a little bit like a clown with plus signs for eyes. Would I recommend this port? I would likely say no. The slowest performing version definitely goes to the Amstrad CPC's port. A real shame because the colour palette is really nice and even the sprites are fairly good to look at too. No music but just sound effects, which is okay given the memory constraints of an 8-bit microcomputer. Now I did think the game was slow, but when a Bobo crashed out from the wall midway through the first mission, the game got even slower where it almost became unplayable and I just gave up. Of course, of this day and age, CPUs can be sped up to make things a little bit better, but the whole purpose of this video is to show you as accurate as possible to how these titles played at the time of release. I think kids of today, when complaining about only running at 60 FPS, should seriously consider watching this game running at a staggering, probably 1.5 FPS at best. Avoid the CPC version of Double Dragon, this is very bad. Now, you might think I am a bit mad to place an Atari 2600 port Double Dragon right here, but let's be honest, firstly, to the coder behind this deserves a big well done for pulling this off. Such a dated machine from the late 1970s, for example, the 2600 version has music, which really isn't a bad rendition given the hardware it's actually working from. The game itself isn't messing around, these baddies mean business. Controller-wise is very basic, but it is what it is and it actually works fine. The game itself isn't scrolling but rather single screen, which I was expecting before playing this version. I was even impressed with the hit detection of this port. I am ashamed to place this here way above C64, but I am trying to do a fair assessment on things for this video. Well done Atari 2600 for this release. The Atari 7800 port of Double Dragon is definitely a mean and punishing game. They will beat you and spit on you without even thinking twice about it. The game is a semi-scrolling screen, meaning that the screen will scroll to the right slightly but then change to a new screen entirely. Like I said, severely punishing game and very similar in difficulty to the previous 2600 version. The only reason this was ranked higher is because it's slight more resemblance to the source material. The controls are very tight in this game, but trust me, when those baddies come in groups of 4 at a time, you really don't stand much of a chance at all. Like other versions and the arcade original, the enemies will literally follow the same direction as you walk around in, like a magnet. Once this happens, you are seriously doomed. Now, ZX Spectrum appreciation is a little bit like Marmite. Some love the old school look, just like myself, and some despise it. Despite the obvious colour clash, the Specky conversion is actually pretty good for what it is. Although the hardest in terms of difficulty, or that's just my reflexes go with age, the game felt like it had weight, and by that I mean that sprites actually felt sturdy when punching them, rather than just whizzing around like paper blown in the winds, just like the other various ports of Double Dragon. I was pleasantly surprised with a Bobo caving through the wall, yet the ladders were not climbable. Of course, adding music as well as sound effects to a Spectrum game of this era would have meant sacrificing parts of the game, and so we just got sound effects with this version, which in its defense actually sound a little better than the poor Melbourne House's C64 mess. If you can get past the difficult level and love the Spectrum look, you would likely have a load of fun with this port. Playing the MSX version was a very nice surprise, although by no means perfect or even brilliant. This port firstly had music and it was completely different from other versions of Double Dragon. It even had sound effects simultaneously. From MSX games that I have played in the past, they are generally very choppy when moving screen. In other words, MSX couldn't scroll smoothly too well compared with other micros of that time. This game actually did a very good job. Even sprites were fairly nicely drawn, even if their torsos did clash with background colours. I was very surprised to discover that sprite collision detection was actually really good too. Oddly enough, the creator of this port copied the source material but added an almost NES look about it. The sprites look very Nintendo, very cutesy as it were. The controller actually responded well too with this game. I even noticed that while pulling off a flying kick, I could actually do this twice in one go, which was a nice little touch. Like I say, by no means perfect, but definitely an upgrade from the last ports I have mentioned in this video. One thing to mention was the lack of a Bobo smashing the wall down. In fact, this version had no ladders to climb whatsoever. Next up, we have the Commodore Amiga conversion. I would like to say this played well as it doesn't actually look that bad at all. However, as I was playing this, I did start to notice that hitting the enemies was often pretty useless as collision detection was fairly poor. A good thing was that unlike previous versions of this game, I could actually climb the ladder if I wanted to midway through the first mission. I found the controls a little non-responsive in this port when attempting to flying kick enemies. It sporadically happened without me being aware it was about to happen. Elbowing enemies seemed like that most effective way of knocking people down. A Bobo actually breaks through the wall in this port, which is a nice touch from the arcade classic. We have no music in this version, just pretty dull sounding sound effects. Not as bad as the C64 versions, but still pretty irritating. One thing that stuck out like a sore thumb was my character. Billy's face had his mouth constantly open. Kinda looked like he was constantly in shock. The scrolling on this version was a little bad too, where to progress I would have to walk very, very close to the side of the screen to get further into the stage. The Atari ST port is actually very similar, if not identical, to the Commodore Amiga's version. If I am honest, and dare I say it, the ST version was much better to control and hitting enemies actually worked too. Graphically, it was almost identical to the Amiga's version, as so was the sound effects. Of course, no music in this version, or even garage door opening at the start of Mission 1. Something that really stood out with both this and the Amiga port are the sounds of somebody being very ill when they are being defeated. Bobo also smashes through the wall midway into this game too. Overly a much better game to play due to better collision detection than what the Amiga had. I briefly played the Atari Lynx port in the past at some point. The first thing you will notice is that yes, the sprites are fairly big for such a small screen such as the Lynx, but after a minute or two of playing, you kind of forget that and enjoy it for what it actually is. It is a very nice port from the source material and manages to pull off the game fairly well. The music being outputted originally from a portable mono system was very good too, complete with sound effects, although the music does drown out this just a little touch. This port even allows the players to switch difficulty levels, which is, to be fair, even on the easiest mode, I still sucked at playing this game. Double Dragon demands constant playing to perfect moves on every port. The visual side of this port is very impressive too. I have played a couple of Lynx games in the past, such as its exclusive Batman Returns, which was the packing game for the Lynx at the time, and I wasn't actually too impressed. But after playing this, I have changed my mind on the Atari Lynx. A fine example of how old school portables could laugh at console and computer ports. All I can say is that if I owned this version of Double Dragon for my Master System back in the day, I would have been very happy to play this at the time. It plays like a solid beat 'em up, collision detection is awesome, music is spot on, and sound effects are very satisfactory. You might notice that the sprites look very similar to the NES version, which isn't particularly a bad thing. Sadly, the NES game is very different to the arcade original. Thankfully, this 8-bit console port got it all right. Bobo crashes through the wall. If the branding of AAA games was a thing back in the day, this version of Double Dragon would have likely had that status. The colours used and sprite design are very well detailed, all in all a major asset to Sega Master System fans, and this version is definitely worth playing. It actually felt like I was getting somewhere with this version, as the difficulty level was pretty well panned. The opening to the game is very impressive too, and all round just a very awesome port of the 1980s original arcade game. The Sega Mega Drive conversion, or Sega Genesis conversion, is very close to perfection, if not pure arcade perfection. The game is also semi-playable whilst being ridiculously difficult, as you will see from the gameplay footage. It's a good, clean and well thought out port, and really showcases what the Mega Drive or Sega Genesis could pull off in its time. The controls are sharp, the buttons are very responsive when tapping a combo to pull off a move. Sound effects are very nicely done too. Really, I am sure if I didn't know any better, I would have thought I was playing the original arcade game. Very impressive stuff, and this was obviously prior to the Sega Dreamcast being known for perfect arcade ports. A very impressive port, and it's also one of the best beat-em-ups on the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis besides Streets of Rage. Next up, we have the Game Boy Advance port. If you haven't played this version, I seriously recommend it. It respects the original game, but slightly modernizes it, including a few new moves which can be pretty effective at times. I also like how the screen wobbles when something smashes. Really adds to the depth of the game itself. The music is also sounding very fresh and a little more modern for the time. The controls for this version are the tightest and most responsive out of any of the versions I have played for this video, hence why my gameplay looks a lot better in this version compared to others. The game also does the awesome opening with Marianne being kidnapped and Billy and Jimmy entering the stage from the garage. The sound effects also sound like they have been given a little more oomph. The Game Boy Advance version could be the version you haven't played, which you need to play. You will see Double Dragon on a new level for sure. So that's it for today's ports video. Let me know in the comments what you think of my decisions in this video, and just like other videos I upload, remember this is all subjective and this is by no means an official list. It's just my opinion. Anyways, thanks for watching.